Hello, my name is Mary Beth Fields, and I am going to be presenting my genre study on poetry in the classroom for our children's literature class, K through 12. I originally decided to do this on poetry because I assessed my own personal library for my children at home and then my classroom library and realized that I do not provide enough poetry for my children or my students at school to experience to read from, and so I thought this would be a great opportunity to delve into it a little bit more on my own so I could become more comfortable with teaching poetry, reading poetry, using it in everyday life. And I wanted to put it in front of my students and my children if I was going to use it more in everyday life. So I found out that there are many ways that people view poetry, but I kind of conglomerated a lot of information together to form my own definition of poetry based on what I've read and what I've researched about. And so my definition of poetry that I came up with was it's a literary work in which special intensity is given to the expression of feelings and ideas by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. Beauty, intensity, and emotion are all characteristics that are typically found in poetry, but they're not always present. Poetry can be written or spoken, or it can even be referred to, such as if I were to say the sentence, Betsy played the piano with poetry, meaning she played it beautifully with nice rhythm and a good pace and with an expression of her feelings through her music. So poetry can be a way that people can express themselves through not just words. It can be expressed through music, through a talent, a specific talent that you have. So there are different ways to use the word poem or poetry in a sentence, but of course today I will be talking about poetry in the classroom that you would read or write on your own or with a group. Some literary elements of poetry are rhyme, meter, metonymy, using synonyms in poetry, antinomy, and metaphors, using metaphors. Kind of going back through each one of those, I had to familiarize myself with some of those terms. Rhyming, of course, we know that words that rhyme together. From research, lots of research throughout the years points to rhyming words promoting phonological awareness as a precursor to emergent literary skills. That hit close to home with me because I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and so ever since I started studying poetry, we have been shouting out as many rhyming words as we can around our house, at the grocery store, in the car, when we're driving places. So we've used little blips of time, 30 seconds here and there even, just to say what rhymes with bike, trike, mic, kite, even. So it's introducing our children to a whole nother way of speaking, and that also can be used in the classroom, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but taking little small moments of your day just to talk about rhyming words and throw out a bunch of rhyming words. Students can really do that while you're waiting in line for PE, or if you have a minute or two before you're walking to a special activity such as music or lunch or Spanish or whatever it may be. There are times throughout your day that you can really interject rhyming words into your classroom that's very easy and very simple. Okay, meter is the basic rhythmic structure of a verse or lines in a verse. Metonymy is one word that can be substituted for another word that means close to the same thing, but the key here is it's a play on words. For example, Robert Frost has a poem called Out and Out, and in which an injured boy holds up his hand and the poem actually uses the phrase, he holds up his hand to keep the life from spilling. The literal meaning of that line is that the boy's trying not to spill his own blood, but it also means that the boy's life is in danger. So that's an example of metonymy. For synonyms, one word that's substituted for another word that means close to or about the same thing. That can be used in poetry. Antinomy is the opposite of something, but it's used to describe the surety of one thing. So it's not simply an antonym, it's actually describing the surety of one thing in writing, in a poem. And of course, a metaphor is when you use two nouns, when a poet would use two nouns to compare or contrast each other. So that could be used in a bunch of different forms of writing, but poets do use those. A lot of these literary elements in their poems, but as I said just a minute ago, that a lot of these literary elements can be used in other forms of writing as well. So it can carry over very easily. I started thinking, well, how am I going to look for poetry in a classroom to provide my students with? What qualities do I need to look for? I do need to look for those literary elements I just mentioned, but when reading through a poem, what should I really look for? So I was thinking about that, and content validity is one of them. I want to make sure that the poem does a good job in teaching and reinforcing the purpose that I will be using it for. I also want to make sure that the potential for transfer of the content of the poem is widespread, that I can potentially take this poem that I would be teaching or exposing my students to, and I could transfer it into other content areas. That would be very important. The quality of the instructional language and any kind of directions that the poem may come with. I want to make sure that my children can read the poem independently. I might have to read it to them at first to explain a few things, but I also want to make sure that they can read it independently. I want to make sure that the poem is flexible, that I can adapt it to many types of learners, that I can provide differentiated instruction with my poetry in the classroom, with learners with difficulties, ELL students, learners with limited backgrounds, that sort of thing. And I want to make sure that the content is not biased to any sort of ethnic group or any type of grouping at all. I want to make sure that the poem reflects a pluralistic view of society. You can, like, I think I mentioned this before, you can use poetry in the classroom in a bunch of different occasions, during snack, during field trips, on the bus, riding the bus, routine transitions throughout your day when you're moving from the classroom to a special area, or even in between subjects when you finish math and you're pulling out your English book. There's a couple of minutes of dead time typically. For second graders, it seems to be more than a couple of minutes, so it's nice to have the children learning and doing something while they're switching out their books. That's a great time to introduce some sort of poetry, read a new poem, expose them to a new author, or simply just shout out rhyming words. Shout a word out, and one student at a time can shout out a word that rhymes with it. There are many different types of poetry that children should be exposed to in the classroom and outside of classroom and free time when they're reading. They are acrostic, autobiographical, ballad, cinquans, concrete poems, diamante, epitaph, found poems, haikus, limericks, and rhyming. There are many other types of poetry out there, but those are just a few that I looked at with the books that I found. I do have a few book examples, and I want to talk through some summaries of those and their awards, so I'll be doing that in my next little